Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu.
Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu. My guest this afternoon is Dr. Thabi Leoka. Thabi has PhD from LSE. She also did her MSc in economics and economic history at the LSE, after which she worked for Investec Asset Management and then moved on to Barclays. She came back to South Africa at about 2011 and headed economic research at Standard Bank. And then she went over to Argon Asset Management. And now she is a corporate advisor, an independent corporate advisor. She commentates on economics a lot, and she sits on some of the advisory panels of government. She was appointed by the Minister of Finance to be part of the VET panel. She also sits on the board of SA Express. I'm privileged to sit with her on the board of Corruption Watch. Thabi is an influencer, a thinker, a strategist, and today we're going to have conversation on institutions, leadership, and the economy. Welcome, Thabi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I think the best place to start perhaps would be given your weight of experience, your diversity, rich diversity of your experience and your learning and your commentary on the South African situation. I often think that institutions provide sound basis for a country's economic progress, for national economic prosperity. And over the last decade, we've seen the damage that has been done to our institutions. We used to say as South Africans that institutions are there to protect us against greedy leaders, against political chaos, and that, as long as we have a great constitution, great institutions, we are fine. But we've seen a systematic erosion of institutions from SARS, SOEs, law enforcement agencies. How do we move from where we are? How do we fix these institutions and move forward as a country?
So the ones that worry me a lot, and it's going to take a very long time to clean the rot, is obviously our legal justice system.
Yeah.
And, from the Hawks to the public protector to the NPA. And yeah, you're right that we have been... we've had these institutions protect us for a while, and we've been very vocal about how, yes, with everything that's going on, at least we've got the institutions that are protecting us, and we have the courts that have protected us, and they've done so very well.
Yeah.
But also, it's very discouraging to hear that institutions such as the Hawks, the NPA, public protector. Have failed us, especially the public protector in recent times versus the Madonsela era, to the point where it's quite clear that people do not trust the Hawks, and people do not trust the NPA, and it makes you wonder how long has the erosion taken place?
Yeah,
and time is important because if someone joined the NPA 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And at a time where the heads and the senior people in that organization were corrupt.
Yeah.
They may have been doing a job that has been corrupt without knowing.
Yeah.
And I also see this with a lot of government departments where certain people were used by their principals, and in many cases, and I use this example as often because I think it's a clear example of how the system was corrupted. So legally, a minister cannot tell a DDG or a chief director or even a director, so anyone within the department, what to do.
Yeah,
they have to do it through the DG.
Exactly.
It got to the point where actually the ministers were telling, chief directors and directors what to do.
Yeah.
And either undermining the DG, and in often cases removing a proper DG and putting up one that would allow or facilitate corruption to take place.
Yeah.
So the question is, how long would it take? it would take a very long time, because you'd have to then dig deep into who was part of the system, who colluded, who was the one who was compromised. And it's not always the most senior, not only the most senior person, but it also goes all the way down to perhaps a chief director or a director. And often, and I've seen this with state-owned entities, when asked about this, the junior person within the organization will say, I got this instruction from a minister, or it came from above.
Yeah.
And I keep hearing this often, both at state entity level and also at government level.
Yeah.
And I think as a country, we need to realize that there are laws.
Yeah.
The country has magnificent laws that protect its citizen. And when somebody says this comes from above, I say to them, do you know that when you're given an instruction that is unlawful, you are complicit.
Exactly, yeah.
So, and there are ways in which you can actually report that person. And we need to also make sure that the reporting system doesn't compromise that person. Because before, people never wanted to speak out because it would mean that they would lose their jobs.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think now that hopefully as we clean up the system, we realize that, whistleblowers get punished, and we need to find a way to protect whistleblowing within organizations. And hopefully then more whistleblowers will come up. But right now it's been a situation where instructions have come, unlawful instructions have come from above, and junior staff members have actually acted upon an unlawful instruction, putting themselves in trouble.
Awesome. I mean, I just remember my own days in government and working fairly senior as chief director. I've never received any instruction from the minister. That is before this new era where chief director receives an instruction from the minister. It was unheard of. That was back in 2007, 2008. And minister would not even meddle on policy directly. Even answering a parliamentary question, you would not get it directly from the minister. You'll get it from the reporting line, and then it goes through the channels. There was a recording system of how information gets passed through. But as you say, it's become conventional. I think part of it is just people not understanding the importance of institutions, the importance of due process, and believing that the voice of a human being is more important than what the rules set out. We may be a rules-based system on paper, but I think we overestimated the extent to which we have swathes of informality in ways in which we operate, or at least in ways in which people understand their roles in the hierarchy of the system of government. Now, as an economist, but also personally, based on your own experience, there is a positive association between good, sound, solid institutional framework in the country, from the actual bureaucracy to the laws of the country, to the processes that one needs to follow, get things done, and economic performance. Would you say that our anemic growth as an economy is in some ways bearing imprints of institutional weaknesses?
Definitely. So let's take state-owned entities as an example. And many have argued that state-owned entities need to be privatized and that they would perform better as private entities. And perhaps there's, I could argue for and against.
Yeah.
And for in that, the skills is usually in the private sector. The money is in the private sector. Even the level of management and where you have a lot to lose, it's in the private sector, because this is private money that is going into a an entity that has to perform well. It would usually have shareholders. So shareholders are very active in the private sector. They hold the executive to account. And there's also, if the executive doesn't perform, the shareholders can remove you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to lose in the private sector. And they are typically more, a lot to lose. And also there's more barriers to mess up.
Yeah.
So it's not
controls
lots of controls. There's compliance issues that are very active within an organization. HR issue, HR, where HR would also do vetting and stuff. So I think that private sector does have its benefits. However, I think that in a country like South Africa, and I think that's why certain state-owned entities were not privatized, is that we don't want a situation where there's privatization of these assets, and which then goes into the hands of, so either controlled by the minority, especially given our history where the minority had the experience. So you would then have an organization that would have senior management be made up of one race. And not because necessarily there's, racism or anything like that. It would be, especially given that when it would have been done, if it would have been done in the early days of just after 1994, you would have very few Black people with experience to run such organizations. And so transformation is a big issue there. I also think that the private sector is not, so it's all about profit and less developmental in nature.
Yeah.
And so it may not feel the need to, it may just want to be one-sided in terms of profit and not understand that there needs to be equity.
Yeah.
There needs to be transformation. There needs to be investments in certain areas. Maybe if you look at, let's say, an airline, it needs to fly in areas where is not typical holiday making area. It needs to be conscious of the demographics of the country. And so the private sector may not see all of that.
Yeah.
It may not be very apparent because it's all about margins and profits. Whereas, so if, let's say, we ran our state-owned entities in the same way as, let's say, China runs its own state-owned entities. China's state-owned entities are one of the best performing in the world and the biggest companies in the world. People will not complain about whether we should be privatizing or nationalizing. The other thing with state-owned entities is that they should be a driver of economic growth. Through either investment, through employment, through if you're talking about a Transnet, through infrastructure investment, rail investment. So the policies that come from government in terms of growth-related policies, they should, at implementation level, state-owned entities should be the drivers of that. From a SANRAL who ensures that we have safe roads. So if they don't work properly, obviously they become inefficient, and their role in terms of economic growth does not, their role doesn't become an economic growth role. It becomes one where the opposite, where they sap the fiscus, where they become deeper and deeper in debt. They then are led to borrow from the private sector and private banks, which leads them to deeper debt. And this debt is also guaranteed by the state, which means that it impacts on the growth, the fiscal or the debt path or the debt trajectory of a country. So if you look at, let's say, contingent liabilities, then those grow because of the exposure, the debt profile of these entities and as a result of the country. So I understand the spirit of keeping them private, but they have to work. And usually, and as I said before, we complain about them because they're not working efficiently and they're sapping the fiscus, which could go elsewhere development, for either schooling, healthcare, somewhere where it's actually needed, versus putting money into entities where many would argue that it's just not throwing money into a hole.
Yeah.
I also think that if you look at what we could do in terms of rail infrastructure, and this idea came to my mind when I was thinking about, we're sitting on the board. I sit on the board of SA Express, as you mentioned earlier, and it did cross our minds we did debate whether we should let this airline go or we should carry on with it. And I realized that what happens when I go to Europe. So I fly into a major hub and I take a train.
Yeah.
And I take a train out of choice, depending on, let's say, how long my holiday is. If it's a few days, then I enjoy taking a train to various towns, visiting friends, and sightseeing. But in South Africa, we don't have that mode of transportation.
No.
Like a fast train that will take us from here to Durban. And a train, what it does is that it unlike a plane where there's business and economy class, and depending on what time of the day or the period in which you book your flight, the tickets are always expensive. Very seldom do people book 6 months in advance to go to Cape Town for a meeting, or to a rural area for a funeral. But for many South Africans, the mode of transport is buses and vehicles. And if we had trains, and trains have 3 categories, you have first class, second class, and third class, it would allow everyone to enjoy a train safe and your transport is efficient. Then the question would be, why do we need to have a national or an SA Express? Because we have
perfectly,
working national railway. So currently, we are in our debate with SA Express. We realize that there is a huge developmental aspect to SA Express. SA Express flies to places where many of the airlines don't fly to, places like Hoedspruit, which I've never been to, but I realized I learned about it when we started looking at where the airline flies to. So it links up. It goes to areas where first it doesn't have competition. It goes to areas where many of the airlines, or in many cases, none of the airlines go to. It's also regional airlines. So it goes to Lubumbashi, Gaborone, it goes to Namibia. So it connects people. And so it also, because it has a regional reach, it speaks to the whole African,
integration.
And it's a business airline. I think 70% of our passengers are business people. So it links up people from a business,
potentially creating new business,
creating new jobs, and so these SOEs are very important from a developmental perspective, but they have to be run efficiently for them to keep to that mandate. Or else they just become, they just suck the fiscus.
Because that's one thing that I'm deeply unsatisfied about, the fact that whenever there's a problem, especially with SOEs, the only answer that people would give is an ideological one, which is intellectually lazy. Because if an SOE is not working properly, understand why is it not working properly, and what battery of solutions can you provide for it to work efficiently and effectively, i.e., to generate developmental outcomes. And there's no rule, there's no decreed from above that SOEs are perennially problematic, because you can actually go to countries that are where SOEs are working perfectly well, not just in China, but also in the Western world. I mean, if you go to, at one point I did quite an extensive study on state oil and how efficiently it was managed by the treasury in Norway, and there are no suggestions of privatizing state oil. And that's just one example. There are about over 100, people don't know this, there are over 100 SOEs in Norway. So it's not just an exception to have state oil because it's a natural resources company. So we don't get into the detail of the challenges that may be plaguing SOEs. And most of them have to do with corporate governance. So fix corporate governance. If it's skills, fix skills. And the questions you have to ask fundamentally about whether they are meeting their developmental objectives, rather than try to identify any error or mistake or weakness as an opportunity to drive a privatization agenda. So that is quite fascinating that you mentioned that. But I also have a follow-up question on because South Africa is also rich in having government finance institutions such as your IDC, state-backed, asset manager in the form of your PIC. And it's not. I've often asked myself a question whether these are really strategically managed, because if you look at some of the investments that they make them in already highly concentrated sectors that erode space for competition, and less about less investments into opening up the economy, creating new opportunities for economic participation, economic inclusion, backing new players in sectors that are concentrated, creating new potential economic champions of the future, or in areas that have to do with tech, tech startups, industries of the future. I think, I don't know what your view is, but I would think that our DFIs should be positioned in such a way as to expand the cake, to multiply economic opportunities, and in a sense to explore new avenues of growing the economy, of absorbing, creating new skills, creating opportunities for new employment for young people who come out of college or who are trained in certain specialized areas, and also to essentially generate momentum for innovation-led growth in the economy. What would your
I'm in full agreement. So I think recently I made a presentation to one of the banks, but the non-state bank ones. And I said to them, what is your role in the development of South Africa?
Yeah.
So you have these stringent credit requirements.
Yeah.
And yes, I know that they're governed by Basel and international signatories to international regulations that prevent them from going below a certain threshold and keeping. They have to keep a certain amount of money within the banks. But what have they done to support small businesses in South Africa? But I think that question is crucially important for our DFIs, which are not governed by some of these strict international regulations. These are state-owned, and their mandate should be developmental in nature. And you are absolutely right that organizations like the PIC and maybe even the IDC have focused so much on the listed companies.
Yeah.
PIC lauds itself as having, X amount of exposure in listed companies. And yet they should do the same for non-listed companies and
with a developmental trust.
With a developmental twist to it. So, there are a lot of South Africans who I often use the apartheid era. And because we talk about entrepreneurship, Black industrialists, as if we didn't have Black industrialists in South Africa. We had Black industrialists in the townships. Every township, I tell many people that, I spent my formative years in Soweto, and the dry cleaner was Black. The
general dealerships, motor mechanics,
upholstery. I remember there was a whole upholstery in Orlando, Bakeries were
Yeah,
black
exactly,
owned.
yeah.
Petrol stations were black owned. These were small economies that were based in townships. And then you look at the TVVC states,
Yeah.
and there you had black people running those homelands, and you had black industrialists, you had black people as business people. So why have we not invested in those to the extent that they would have been a ShopRite today?
Exactly.
And
I mean,
these
it's crazy. I mean, I think it's good to bring that up because you would know that in Europe, you still have the big sort of stores,
but
your
it's family-owned
Tesco,
stores.
your Sainsbury, your Asda, but you also have co-op stores. You have co-op stores, not just in the UK, but also in France.
Look at Italy.
Geneva.
Italy is an economy that is run by small family-owned businesses. It doesn't have a lot of these big businesses. Many of their businesses are family-owned. So I think that I think there was a failure in the system in the initial years to support these thriving black industrialists who were limited to a certain jurisdiction because of apartheid. We failed to give them support in the New South Africa. And actually, we started seeing companies that were either non-existent or very, very small now become big oligopolies.
Yeah.
Within the same, within post 1994, that happened. We saw an increase in some of these white-owned companies and a deceleration and almost diminishing of, and some of them don't even exist, black companies that existed. So I just think that there's obviously, we talk about these black industrialists that we never had talent. We do. We just, in the New South Africa, disappointingly, they haven't been given that support that they need. And it is, I think, the duty of these DFIs to identify young black entrepreneurs and fund them.
Yeah.
I think that, an Investec is not an old company. Bidvest is not an old company.
Not an old company.
These companies, as I say, I'm from Joburg. So I watched these companies go from nowhere to now being companies that I lived in London for 10 years. And I saw, you see a Bidvest bus or a truck drive past and you're like, wow, this company, when I was at university, didn't exist. And look at Bidvest now.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of companies that didn't exist that exist now. I mean, your Discovery is fairly new. The whole PSG group is new. Tiger Brands is new. Pioneer Food. Many companies are recent, and I think we had time to contribute to developing a new class of black entrepreneurs, black industrialists. It's not that the white folks are genetically endowed to run a business or to run, and I think we've missed an opportunity, and we still continue to do that because in my view, our priorities are not right. I mean, I remember an anecdote of a young woman entrepreneur. She was in her early 20s at the time. I was working at DTI. I think her name is Nondwentle. She started the chocolatier to have her own sort of processing and retail facility for chocolates. And she had been through training and she had a plan to do this. And she was already what they call minimum value propositions because she was already producing these. And I had met her at a seminar organized by the UCT Graduate School of Business and IMD Switzerland. It was in Cape Town, and she was participating there. And she was telling a story about her journey in starting this company, but she needed to scale up. And she sent us a request at DTI. I was as an official there at the time, and I looked at this and I sort of took it up. And incidentally, she had also written, I think, letters or emails to the DG, to the minister. The long and short of it, she didn't get help from a government department. Yes, and highly promising entrepreneur. Now she has a fully fledged company, and I think government could have taken a lot of credit out of this. And you hear stories of many entrepreneurs in farming, agribusiness, manufacturing, and other sectors, finance. I mean, it's just crazy that we don't have new um, financing institutions run by Black people, by Black entrepreneurs. I like this kind of discussion on economics that is not, you're not looking just at the macro stuff, but you're looking at the realities at the micro level and some of the challenges that entrepreneurs still battle with structurally. Yet there are these massive pockets of money in IDC, in PIC, maybe NEF, DBSA, and yet you're not getting results. You're not creating new value in the economy. I mean, they would tell you that, well, we finance so and so, but the scale is really, really, really small, and part of the problem, of course, lies in the credit committees in these institutions. They are similar to the white-owned banks. The risk models are designed for a market that doesn't, or entrepreneurs that don't exist, and a country that doesn't exist. And I mean, I've been inside some of these discussions about creating, mezzanine finance for small scale, smallholder farmers. And you look at the models; they are so complicated, and you know that this thing is just not going to
something
make
like
sense.
a land bank. I think something like over 95% of loans that they extend.
Yeah, I've looked at it.
People.
Yeah, it's to white-owned.
And that's because Black people don't qualify. You need to obviously have money and ability to pay back. And obviously they put very strict rules and regulations for a lot of people. So basically they block those who would like to get into farming from gaining access to funding. And those who have access to credit or can qualify for their credit, they're the ones that will get the loan. And it doesn't make it's nonsensical. I can't believe that, the land bank is the one that's supposed to actually drive land reform via a transformation there in their lending patterns. And yet their lending patterns haven't changed, I argue, since the beginning of the land bank. And I think the land bank was started in apartheid South Africa. So those little things that one wonders about, that what are you doing as a government organization?
We'll pick up that on part 2 of our podcast.
Okay.
We'll end the part 1 of our discussion and we'll continue again.
Thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Mzu.